Okay, everybody see my screen okay? All right, great. So we had our first session looking at philosophy, wisdom, faith, the division of the sciences, faith and reason. Um, Last week we got a brief introduction to logic and epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. And this week we're going to delve into philosophy in the ancient world. So here, okay. Sorry, I get my little toolbox out of the way here. Um, so this is a map of ancient Greece and the surrounding area. So right here, is my mouse visible in your screen? Yes, okay. So you can see Athens here. This is the center of ancient Greek philosophy. You're familiar somewhat perhaps with Delphi, the oracle at Delphi, which will come into play here when we talk about Socrates. Here's Sparta. You're familiar with Sparta, not particularly important for philosophy, but just a point that you're familiar with. Um, some of the ancient philosophers we'll be talking about come from around this area, but also over here in Elea, in southern Italy. Then over here in Miletus, the first philosopher we're going to talk about, Thales, is from here. And Aristotle is from Stagira up here. And he'll come down and study with Plato in Athens, as we'll see. Okay, so we're going to look at pre-Socratic philosophy. Now, already the title of it tells you something about it, that we sort of look at Socrates as a turning point for philosophy, and we'll see why in a little bit. So I'm gonna briefly run down the philosophers here that were in play before Socrates. You can see a little bit of what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are going to be responding to. So these philosophers had a strong emphasis on nature, and the question was basically, what are the principles that define the world around us, that bring it into being, that cause it to continue to be what it is? So we have in modern philosophy, we tend to categorize things with very defined lines. That doesn't always fit well in fact, but it's convenient. It's a convenient way to organize them. So often you'll see them talked about as being monists or pluralists. So that just depends on, are we talking about a philosopher who posits one thing as the essential principle of nature? Can everybody still hear me here? Okay, I just got a notification that I was just signed out. That's weird. Okay. Anyway, I guess I can't tell you. Tell me if I disappear because you won't see me. Anyway, we'll find out. Okay. So the monists would posit one principle as the central principle of everything we encounter, and the pluralists posited several. In monism, that's often categorized in three ways. Naive monism, which is really just saying, okay, there's one principle, and I mentioned Miletus a little while ago on our map. Thales is from there. He's kind of considered the first. He's the first philosopher that we have on record in the West. Okay, so the first classical philosopher, Thales of Miletus, he posited water as the one thing that everything was made out of in one way or another. Of course, earth, air, fire, water, these were considered to be the elements of the world, but Thales posited water as in some way more central, more basic than the others. Another one after him, Anaximander, he posited the infinite. So whatever precisely that means, he posited the infinite as the principle which defined all reality. Anaximenes posits air. Later, perhaps when we get to medieval philosophy, I'll give you a quote from St. Augustine where he refers to Anaximenes and his doctrine about air. So naive monism, would posit one principle. Double aspect would it's still monism in the sense that there are two principles, but they come together as one thing. So Pythagoras, and yes, this is the same Pythagoras of the Pythagorean theorem fame, although there's no actual evidence that Pythagoras came up with the Pythagorean theorem, it's that Pythagoras. So Pythagoras had a strong emphasis on mathematics, mathematical objects as being primary, but also even more basic to that, a monad and the dyad. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with these philosophers because we have a lot of ground to cover today. So I'm going to rush through these without really doing justice to any of them for these pre-Socratics. But another one, Heraclitus. So Heraclitus also this kind of double aspect monism where we have he posits a unity of opposites, a unity of opposite principles. We can see over on the right here are a few quotes which illustrate this principle. So he says, "The sea is the purest and impurest water. Fish can drink it, and it is good for them. To me, it is undrinkable and destructive." So for us, 2,500 years later, we can understand this maybe a little bit better scientifically than Heraclitus could. But it's a paradox in that there's one thing, but it's two things at the same time that are opposed to each other. It is both good and bad. It is good for the fish, and it's bad for me. So if you've ever heard you've heard the phrase, you can't step into the same river twice, that is based on some things Heraclitus said, which is, here's an example, ever newer waters flow on those who step into the same rivers. Okay, so it's, again, you have this unity of opposites. It's one river, it's the same river, and yet it's multiple waters flowing over and over. It's one and many at the same time. So again, here, we both step and do not step in the same rivers. This is related to the same principles. We are and are not. So we are in the same and are not in the same at the same time. That's kind of this paradox that he's pointing to. It's just kind of just supposed to get you to think about things a little bit deeper than you might naively. Okay. All right. Absolute monists basically denied change. That's really what it comes down to. This starts with Parmenides, and the next two, Zeno and Melissus, they follow in Parmenides. So if we had this recognition of change with Heraclitus, with Parmenides, whatever is, what is not, cannot be. Zeno, if you've ever heard of Zeno's paradoxes, this is the Zeno of Zeno's paradoxes fame. So Zeno said, this is something that both Plato and Aristotle respond to, especially Aristotle, and we'll get to that next week. If you're going from point A to point B, you have to go halfway, right? Well, to get there, you have to go halfway to the midpoint, and you have to go halfway to that quarter point. But if you have to travel over an infinite number of points, you're never going to make it. So this is his proof that motion is impossible, and we'll see how Aristotle addresses that next week. Okay, pluralists, with Empedocles, he affirms the basic four elements, earth, air, fire, water, but he also considers love and strife as principles. So these are principles of change among those four elements. Anaxagoras, he conceives of these sort of unformed ingredients and mind. So nous is the Greek word that's generally translated as mind. So here's the first time we have kind of one overarching intelligent principle as as something that brings everything into being. Okay, now if you're wondering where atoms come from, we can credit Democritus and his predecessor Leucippus with that. He said everything is atoms and void. So atom comes from atom, the Greek word means uncuttable. Okay, so that's what atoms were considered to Democritus, these basic things that cannot be divided at all. Of course, Democritus thought that there were actually atoms that were large enough to be visible. Um, so that's a bit different than the modern conception, but atomism itself didn't originate in the past couple hundred years. It originated with ancient Greek philosophy. Any questions on the pre-Socratics so far? Okay, we're going to go now into Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So the environment that Socrates found himself in Athens was one where much of the intellectual life was dominated by the influence of the sophists. So to understand the place of the sophists, consider that in a direct democracy, pleading your case, getting what you wanted, meant convincing large groups to go along with your view. So certain men marketed their skills in rhetoric, of this kind of specialized rhetoric of being able to convince anybody of just about anything. And rich Athenians would actually hire them as tutors for their young men. So in a general way, sophist just means wise one. But the reason that philosophers came to be known as philosophers, that is love of wisdom rather than wise men, was basically out of humility. I think that Pythagoras was credited with that as well. But so a true philosopher wouldn't acclaim himself as wise. So the sophists are those who marketed themselves as being wise. They professed to be wise, and they sold their wisdom. So that's the derogatory sense that we retain today, calling someone a sophist or accusing them of sophistry. It's kind of having this reputation of duplicity, being able to argue both sides of an issue. So in this case, it's less about truth and more about winning. You just couldn't trust a sophist. So Socrates, in much of the ancient literature, well, in some of the ancient literature, there's not a lot of ancient literature in terms of variety concerning Socrates. He is actually considered as just another sophist. So if we look at the comic poet Aristophanes, he has a play about the clouds. Aristophanes was an acquaintance of Socrates, so he knew him, but didn't understand him very well. And he depicts Socrates in this play, The Clouds, as being somebody who's so high, his head is so high up in the clouds that he is utterly oblivious to the reality of the world below. Socrates was poor, and he claimed not to be wise. So going back to Delphi, I mentioned before, the oracle at Delphi, there's a story that Socrates tells in Plato's dialogue, The Apology, where Socrates' friend asks the oracle who the wisest person is. And the oracle says Socrates. And Socrates says he can't figure out why exactly this would be. And then finally, he figures out that it's because he's the only person who realizes that he's not wise, and everybody else thinks they're wise, and they're really not. So he tested. He said he had to go test this testimony, this statement of the oracle about whether he was the wisest. So he'd go around Athens talking to people, just anybody, craftsmen, politicians, just anybody he met, and he challenged their accepted ideas. And he realized that the craftsmen were, or the artists were, wise in their art, but they thought they were a lot wiser than that. And then some people, especially the politicians, were not even wise in the art of politics. So again, Socrates realized that what the oracle meant was Socrates is the only person who realizes he's not wise. So often Socrates is going to be questioning people about what virtue is. He felt that he had this duty from the oracle to help make people wise, or at least realize how wise they weren't. And so he would ask them what virtue is and if you look, for instance, at Plato's Republic, which the cave allegory is from, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, that starts off with the question of what is justice, and it's a massive work. But the central question, which is not quite solved at the end, is what is justice. In his dialogue, in Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, Socrates is asking Euthyphro about piety, and the irony in it is that um, Euthyphro is on his way to court to take his father to court, and this to the ancient Greeks would be an extremely unpious, impious thing to do. So another thing besides virtue, Socrates had an emphasis on definitions. What is a thing? What is a good definition of a thing look like? And he'll ask people this, and they'll start off by giving examples. Well, piety is saying your prayers to the gods and giving sacrifices to the gods. And Socrates would say, well, those are examples of piety, but what is piety? What is justice? What is knowledge? We talked about that in the first session. That's from Plato's Theaetetus. Not just examples of knowledge, but what is knowledge itself? So in his clashes with the sophists, often in some cases it would be like they claim that they can teach anybody to be virtuous. So he would catch them in contradictions there, or he would catch them in their faulty reasoning that Socrates would expose. So he was regarded by the powerful in Athens as an enemy and a corrupter of the youth. He was actually accused of impiety to the gods and corrupting the youth, and was executed famously in 399 by drinking hemlock. So let's take a look. What is Socrates' legacy? He had no writings of his own. He had no real doctrines. In fact, in the dialogues of Plato, they often end at an impasse, an aporia. But he does become the mouthpiece of Plato's doctrines, and this is really where he becomes famous. Aristotle credits Socrates with an emphasis on driving at universal ethical principles, at getting at definitions, and at mastering the method of induction. So he is regarded today as the father of Western philosophy. Here, I just have a little quote from Plato's Phaedo, which is the dialogue that tells the story of Socrates' last moments. And if you, this is Socrates right before his swan song, right? You seem to think me inferior to the swans in prophecy. They sing before, too, but when they realize that they must die, they sing most and most beautifully, as they rejoice that they are about to depart to join the God whose servants they are. As I believe myself to be a fellow servant with the swans and dedicated to the same God, and have received from my master a gift of prophecy not inferior to theirs, I am no more despondent than they on leaving life. So the Phaedo, Plato's Phaedo, famously is an extended argument for the immortality of the soul. Okay, so that is Socrates. Let's take a look at Plato. He was a student of Socrates. He, unlike Socrates, wrote his philosophy, but wrote it out in dramatizations, in these dialogues, such as you were reading an excerpt from in the cave allegory from the Republic. There are some letters that are extant from Plato, and scholars consider his philosophy more Socratic in the beginning, but more Platonic at the end. And what do I mean when I say his philosophy was Platonic? Well, the philosophies, his dialogues tell stories mainly that involve Socrates. And but then it can be very difficult to tell which of those ideas in those that are in Socrates' mouth are Plato's and which are Socrates. So the ones that I mentioned before about this emphasis on what is virtue, what does a good definition look like? These are things that scholars think are authentically Socratic. And then the more dogmatic things we'll get to in a moment are considered more Platonic. So his main doctrines were taught in his school called the Academy. So here's some examples of this that were unique to Plato. No certainty can be found in a world that's constantly changing. So there's a need to search for unchanging being. And Plato found that in what he posited as the forms or ideas. So the forms are what is most real. They're the universal natures of things. And the highest form is the form of the good, which again, we encounter in the cave allegory. So what makes someone a philosopher is knowing the forms themselves, especially that form of the good. So the forms are these archetypes of everything. And as we talked about last week with knowledge, the forms are what give things their being and give us the knowledge of them. So we have knowledge by recalling the forms, which we already know. And the things have being from the forms, but only imperfectly. So the things we encounter are imperfect participators in those forms. Regarding the soul, like I mentioned with Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, the soul is immortal. The soul is not a form. This will be different later with, say, St. Thomas. He'll say the soul is the form of the body. The soul also has its own existence apart from the body. So the body is more like something that the soul drives or steers around, rather than something that's essentially united to it. Virtue, for Plato, virtue is knowledge. And the form of a virtue, the form of justice, is a pattern for conduct. Okay, so this is interesting because it means that all vice is really a lack of knowledge, and this is something where Aristotle will differ. Okay, cosmologically, Plato discusses in his mystical dialogue the Timaeus, something called a demiurge or a divine craftsman, and later philosophers will pick up on this, and it will somewhat be merged with the Christian idea of a creator. Now, for Plato's legacy, what can we say about that? The 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead says, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. All right, so let's take a look at the cave allegory, that reading. So what do you think about all the figures that are represented in Socrates' explanation here? Do they all seem to be accounted for?
John, I was a little unclear about what that question meant. Do you mean, can you explain what you mean by the word figures? Are you talking about the figures that they were seeing, the shadows, or the figures?
Well, really, I mean the people.
The people, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So let's, I'm going to share my screen again. All right, so who all do we have? Who are the first ones mentioned?
The people living in the cave that are chained down looking straight ahead.
All right. So over here, I'm going to put, here's a wall, right? So we have people kind of, I'm going to put them in chairs here. sitting here in their chairs. Okay, and they're chained and they're looking at this wall. Okay.
Mhm.
All right, what else do we have? What else can we put in this picture?
Well, on the parapet on the side of the cave.
Okay, there's a parapet and there are people up here. You can see that this is not my form of art. And they're carrying signs, right? They're carrying signs with different shapes and they're talking, right? They're saying things. And what else is here?
Well, there's the light.
Okay, so there's a fire behind them, and the fire is giving light that's shining through these signs and casting shadows onto the wall where the chained up.
Not the way I visualized it. Was I visualizing it wrong? I thought the people were behind the parapet and the things they were carrying were protruding over.
So what Socrates describes is people standing up on a parapet, and there's a fire behind them which is shining a light which causes shadows to be cast on the wall here for the people who are chained.
I must have misread it. I thought he had the people walking behind the parapet, and these things were protruding above the parapet and throwing shadows.
Okay, well they're walking along it back and forth, so they are walking, and that's what causes motion and change to be visible over here. And then what else?
Are their shadows visible of these people?
That is not mentioned.
So again, I thought they were behind the parapet. So as they walked along, their shadows wouldn't be cast. Only the shadows of the things that are protruding above it.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily look at this as having to be too strict in terms of the how the light is shining. So what happens in this allegory? What happens? What happens to some of these people down here?
So if one person is removed from the cave and then taken back up above the parapet to, if you want to call it the real world.
Right, that's right. So way up here out of the cave, I'm gonna move my toolbox out of the way. Okay, they come up out of the cave, and there's the sun. There are trees out here. Right, there's the real stuff, right, of the real world. What happens before they go up there? What do they see first?
They're just seeing the shadows from people walking.
They see the shadows, and then they see this. So then they see what's casting the shadows, and then they go up. So there's kind of there are a few different movements here, right? They're broken from their chains and forced to look at the things that are casting the shadows, and they see this fire as well. So that's already jarring, and it doesn't seem real because all they've been seeing is the shadows over here. And then further, they're forced to come up here into the light. And as Socrates says, at first, they can only see at night, right? At first, they can only see at night because they're not accustomed to the light. And then gradually their eyes adjust and they can see the things, the real things as they really are. And then especially the sun, which represents the form of the good.
John, you were asking about the figures in the allegory,
Mhm.
could it be fair to say that one of the figures is the person who freed or who forced the freed prisoner up
Yes.
the hill?
Yeah. So it must start with somebody who's already out here, right? Who's free and able to come in and free the prisoners. Okay. So that's another figure. So in Socrates' explanation of the allegory, um, who is this person? What is this person's function in society, or role, or expertise?
Could it be a philosopher or someone who's trying to get them to see wisdom?
Exactly. So this is the philosopher. So the philosopher is the person who has seen the form of the good, basically, the person who encounters the forms as they are. And the philosopher has this responsibility to go down, to go back, and um, to attempt to bring his fellows into the light of truth. So who are these? Who are these people who are chained down here?
General society.
That's right. He says, this is right on the first page on the right side, halfway down. He says, just like us. It's an odd image you're describing to me, Socrates, with these oddly chained people. Just like us, I said. So that part is accounted for. What about these people here? Does Socrates explain them? So these ones seem to be unaccounted for in Socrates' description. So let's leave them for a moment and come back to them and go on to the questions of, can this be a good metaphor either for education or for spiritual growth?
As a teacher, I'm going to voice my opinion about it for education. In education, there's the theory of the schema, in which a child or any learner has information in their mind about a particular topic or subject. There's always some kind of prior knowledge. And that when new knowledge comes in, we actually have the learner has a shift in their schema in which they're actually accommodating that new knowledge, changing a misconception that they knew, or replacing it altogether if it were completely false. So my initial thought was, no, this is not a good example for education, because from what I took away, it's that the shadows were lies. They were, deliberate misconceptions. But now, like, upon reflection, it could just be incomplete information. So I think if you look at it a certain way, it could work for education.
Yeah, that's a good point there, because these signs that are used to cast the shadows are copies of the real things. So we have kind of a double denigration here of the real thing as it is. We have copies being made of it, and then we have shadows of the copies. So it's not the case that what's here is completely false. And plus, we have the notion of innate ideas, so that the forms are already in some way innate in us, and we're coming to remember them. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
I think it's also important that he, where is it? And on page 4, he refutes the idea that we are the blank slate, but affirms that everybody is capable of acquiring wisdom.
Yeah. So that's true, and that's from another reading and reading further into the Republic. It's questionable whether Plato actually thinks that that anybody is capable of this. But if we look at this alone, it does look like that. So what about the fact of being forced to deal with something that you don't quite understand, which ends up being more real or better for you than you thought at first? Is that something that can relate either to education or to the spiritual life?
Well, what I got out of it was that maybe it's just a form of humility. We have to accept that we don't know and submit to the fact that someday we might understand, but now we have to sort of suspend our knowledge. So that could
Yeah,
be it's religious, you know.
yeah. I think that notion of humility is definitely important, and I think it comes into play too when towards the end when Socrates is talking about how we judge people that seem to be out of sorts, that seem to be not quite with it. They might be going one direction or the other. They might be somebody who really has a much deeper understanding than us and isn't quite handling the ways of the world, or it might be somebody who has a much lower understanding of us and is trying to make their way up. So it gives us another reason not to judge too rashly. We never know where somebody is coming from. So what kind of things might and I encourage you to think very broadly and not think in kind of a doctrinal way about what the cave allegory or any of the philosophical texts we read mean in an absolute sense. 2,500 years later, philosophers are still disagreeing about essential aspects of the cave allegory. So there are manifold interpretations to this, which is why it's survived as the most iconic element, perhaps, of Plato's works for so long. So just think, just with your everyday experience on this stuff. That's where philosophers started, is just with everyday experience. So I just say that to encourage people to speak up and give your idea about what something might mean. So what might the shadows be? What might be the shadows think about in either in Plato's time or in contemporary society?
I think in general, shadows are just kind of people's first impression of something. It's just kind of how I've interpreted this. And kind of go back to the discussion of how we learn something, right? The first time that that a kid sees a dog, they don't know that there's a word for a dog. They might not know what a dog is versus a cat because they don't know that a cat exists, but they now have some concept of what a dog is, right? They might not know that there's a difference between a border collie and a poodle, but now they have some general sense that something of this sort exists. So it's kind of just like that first sense, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great insight. It can be kind of a first impression of something, and that'll relate to what we're going to get to in Aristotle in a little bit, where he's talking about how we first come to know things in a general way. What about in kind of a moral way? What might be moral shadows that can get us caught up and distracted, that we're chained to?
Just general precepts, do's and don'ts that we're told from other people.
Okay, yeah. So or maybe it can be just attachments to worldly things. These worldly things that are most apparent to us, but not the most important thing for us to be stuck to.
Yeah, I'm thinking of when you said kind of that example of piety, right? Of Socrates and piety of, well, it might be an example of something, but it's not the definition of piety and that type of concept. Or we might be able to see an example of, right, charity. That's not necessarily the only way that someone can be charitable.
Yeah, so it might be a kind of a primitive understanding of something that's not very deep yet. Great. Okay, we're going to go on now to I'm sorry, I got to take away my beautiful artwork. We need to in order to go on to Aristotle. So Aristotle of Stagira, he was a student of Plato at the academy. He was also a tutor of Alexander the Great. And so let's look at some basic philosophical developments. Like Socrates, he thought that philosophy needed to be something about life, something part of our everyday life. Like Plato, he also sought the universal natures of things. And so he takes Plato's idea of forms as a universal nature of something, but he doesn't put them somewhere separate. We've talked about this a little bit before. We'll talk about it more next week when we get to his natural philosophy. But knowledge for Aristotle comes from sensation and first principles. We talked about this last week as well. So not like Plato coming from the form or from a memory of the form, but through our experience of the world. That's not to say that Plato's epistemology is completely divorced from experience, but it's still very different. So his method is where he will review current and previous ideas and philosophies. So he was really the first historian of philosophy, because he'll go through when he starts with the physics or with the ethics, he'll go through all the previous opinions of things, and he'll talk about what was good about them, what doesn't work. So he'll judge them, and he'll synthesize and analyze different parts of their philosophies to come up with the new way, the right way, the Aristotle's way. So in terms of, let's see, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip through a little bit of this. But remember, we talked about, when I mentioned Parmenides said that everything is one, that there's no change. And Parmenides' reasoning for this was that, well, if something changes, it must change from non-being to being, or from being to non-being. But non-being can't exist, so there can't be change, right? It sounds, there's something intuitive about it on the one hand, and something that that you can sense isn't quite right. So Aristotle in his metaphysics takes this and says to Parmenides, being is spoken of in many ways. And what that means is that it's one thing to say that I am a man. That says something about my essence. It's another thing to say that I am bald. That's something that can change about me without changing my essence. So there's a way that I can change and not change at the same time, just not in the same respect. So we had a couple excerpts from Aristotle here, from his Physics and Ethics. So this short passage from Aristotle's Physics. What could be principles of something versus elements?
Well, he defines principles of primary cause.
Okay, so that would be, so principles as causes, yeah, and how would that contrast with elements? What would elements be?
And I got to read down further.
He doesn't necessarily define it here.
Yeah, the element, I want to say the secondary cause, what follows from the principle.
Okay, so principles would be something primary. Elements. What other things might elements refer to?
I was thinking elements were what.
Oh, I lost your audio right at the end of that, Sarah.
Oh, it's because I was letting your dad, he looked like he was going to
Oh.
say something, so I cut myself off.
No, go ahead.
My thought was, I was thinking more, and I could be totally wrong because I really wasn't sure, was I looked at the first principles being like the essence or the foundation of something, and the elements being the like the ingredients or the exemplars, the things that comprise like the parts and
Yeah.
that
So like
comprise the whole.
elements as like constituent parts of something, where principles might be kind of those primary causes. What about what is Aristotle considered to be the natural way of coming to know things, coming to know these principles and elements? So think about Rebecca, kind of like what you were saying with those shadows on the wall, right? That could be a way. We start off with kind of a vague idea of something. We start off with an idea of a general kind of thing, and then
It becomes clear. It becomes clear. As we see it more, it becomes clear, and we can the fog clears away, basically.
yeah. Oh, there goes my light.
Like your light. Yeah, there you go.
That's right. So it's kind of like experience gives us a feedback on our concepts and refines
Right.
them over time. And what does he mean by what's more knowable by nature? So what's more knowable to us versus more knowable by nature? What does that mean? Or what might that mean? So what's most knowable? What's most apparent to us?
What you get through the senses?
Exactly. What is more primary, more intelligible by nature? When you see me, do you just see blackness and whiteness and just what immediately sees your eyes? What do you know of me? My essence, right? So
Right.
what's more intelligible, what's more knowable by nature is not what first strikes us. And this is a principle we see all throughout Aristotle and Aquinas, is we come to know things by what's first more noble to us, which is which comes through the senses, and then to come to know what's more knowable by nature. So let's take a look at in the Ethics. What does Aristotle say is the human good?
Happiness.
Happiness, that's right. Happiness. Why is happiness the human good? What makes that the ultimate good?
Saying that it has like a finality to it. It is an ends. It's not a means.
Yeah, so we never seek happiness for the sake of anything else, right? We don't say, I want to be happy so that I can have power. I want to be happy so that I can have pleasure. No, it's always the other way, right? Happiness is always what we desire through seeking the other things. So that's how Aristotle makes that the human good. And what does that have to do with what Aristotle says is the function of man? And where does he get this idea of functionality as being important for happiness? So think about what makes me a pianist? Playing the piano, right? So what makes me a good pianist? Playing the piano well, right? So we could take that idea and apply it, Aristotle says, to being human. What makes me human? And it's not the fact, he says, that I just have life. And this is on page 8 in the lower left-hand. Sorry, it's not just that I have life. That's all plants have that, right? It's not just that I have sensation, because all animals have that. But it's that I have rationality and all of the things that set me apart from everything else, including the apprehension of what is beautiful. All of these things flow from my rationality. So my function it resides in the active use of that rationality and using it well, right? So if we're talking about engaging in that function, that rationality in an excellent way, that's where we get the word virtue. That's where we get virtue from, okay? So that's what virtue is, essentially, to Aristotle. Now, what does it mean when he says one swallow does not make a spring? Did you know this phrase was that old?
Basically, just because you do something once right doesn't mean you're going to do it right forever. You become a perfect man just that you've had one instance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So virtue doesn't consist in just doing something right once, but it will come through habit. And we'll see this when we get to ethics in a little bit more detail. Now, what about, is ethics an exact science? Are we looking for exact and very, very specific, well-defined lines here?
We can't find them.
That's right. That's right. So he says, we must not allow side issues to outbalance the main task in hand. We must not look for equal exactness in all departments of study. Earlier in the Ethics, I believe it is, he says that our goal is not to define good, but to be good, right? So this could be a point also against Plato, that virtue is not just about knowledge. Great, okay. Any questions here on Plato, Aristotle, pre-Socratics before we go on to look at post-Aristotelian philosophy? All right. So let's look at what happened in the Hellenistic period. So a couple schools of philosophy it's good to know something about, that you'll recognize some of these terms here. So cynicism, you see here a picture of Diogenes of Sinope, who Plato reportedly said was Socrates gone mad. So cynicism was considered philosophy to be a way of life, not just an intellectual or armchair philosophy pursuit, but it valued self-sufficiency, close to nature, against the common conventions, and a very negative kind of asceticism. So not kind of a positive asceticism looking for virtue, but in a way that really devalued what is material. There's a lot of images of Diogenes of Sinope will picture him with a lamp, as you see here. And reportedly that's because he went around Athens looking for somebody good, and he could never find anybody. Skepticism is associated with the academy, that's Plato's academy. And of course, the key element of skepticism is suspension of judgment about truth claims. So if you remember with Plato's dialogues, they often ended in that aporia, that something that's not quite settled. Well, if you take that to extreme, you get skepticism. Okay? Epicureanism sees pleasure as the good. It had also an atomistic natural philosophy, like we saw with Democritus. The criteria for truth in this case is sensation, preconceptions, and feelings. So here's, obviously this is very susceptible to relativism. This is from Epicurus. Every pleasure then, because of its natural kinship to us, is good, yet not every pleasure is to be chosen. Even as every pain also is an evil, yet not all are always of a nature to be avoided. All right, so far so good, no problem here. Yet by a scale of comparison and by the consideration of advantages and disadvantages, we must form our judgment on all these matters. For the good on certain occasions we treat as bad, and conversely the bad as good. So there's no ultimate notion of bad and good. Now earlier, Epicurus himself had an idea of pleasure had a long view of pleasure. So that would include some asceticism in the present. So if you go for a long time without eating, then it will be more pleasurable when you finally do eat. That's the early Epicureanism, or tend your garden, all right? So these little practices that will give you more pleasure in the long run. Later it descends more into sense pleasure as the ultimate good. We'll see this is something that St. Paul fights against. Okay, Stoicism had significant philosophical contributions in language and the development of logic, especially modal logic, which is logic considering things as in terms of what's necessary and possible. Considered two principles, matter as passive and the pneuma as active, and the latter, here's a quote that we'll get to later, seminal reason, the pneuma as the seminal reason or logos of the cosmos. Also, Stoicism was pantheistic, so the divine was somehow in everything, somehow permeating everything. Virtue for Stoicism, living according to reason, had a strong sense of duty, and emotion and passion are considered to be irrational and to be avoided. And there was also a notion of a combination of contemplation and action. So one of our readings was one of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor and also a Stoic philosopher. So in this meditation of Marcus Aurelius, what diagnoses does he give for our discontent?
Was it the badness of men, the lot of the universe, the I guess physical things, like physical conflicts and fame? Was that what the diagnoses were? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, exactly. So he has here's the cave again. Let me get rid of all that. So he has badness of men, and then bad fortune, basically, and then attachment to material things, and then attachment to fame, right? So he diagnoses these as being the reason for discontent. So what is his solution here? Or we can jump to just kind of your general impressions of how this accords or doesn't accord with Christianity.
Seem to be, accept your lot in life, and you'll be content and tranquil and happy.
Say that again?
Seem to be saying, accept your lot in life. Then
Yeah.
you will be tranquil and happy.
Exactly. That is kind of a major point of Stoic philosophy, kind of accepting the place that Providence has assigned to you.
He also emphasized taking, like, instead of looking externally for retreat and peace and solace, to really to go inward.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a meditation. It's truly a meditation in that sense, and kind of turning inward to consider these things. But you can see perhaps where, I mean, what is he lacking? What is he lacking that we have in Christian meditation?
Prayer.
Yeah, he lacks prayer. He lacks any kind of conversation or relationship with God, which is the essence of meditation for us. So on the one hand, we can look at his diagnoses perhaps and agree with them, and on the other hand, we can see that there's something essential that's missing here. So it's I think that there's a lot in Marcus Aurelius and some of the other Stoics, if you look at Seneca too, that is really great for reflection and just kind of stepping back and looking at your place in the world. But obviously it has its limits. So any other thoughts on Marcus Aurelius?
Can you maybe just expound briefly on what he means by the mind mingles not with the breath? It's on, it's almost at the end. Consider then further that the mind mingles not with the breath. Like the third to last paragraph on your handout.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Consider then further that the mind mingles not with the breath, whether moving gently or violently, when it has once drawn itself apart and discovered its own power. So this, oh, there goes my light again. So here, you can think of this in a contemplative way as drawing away from the material world. So there would be really a kind of real dualism here, a duality where he's saying that, look, I can take my mind away from what's material, from all these corporeal things that he's just mentioned that are bothering me, and that's what I really am. That's where I really am, is my mind, and that I can maintain my control or my power over. That's the retreat that I think is kind of the essence of this meditation.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, one more section to look at here: ancient Neoplatonism, ancient philosophy. So this is Da Vinci's School of Athens. We've talked about Plato here, right? He's the one pointing to the forums, and here's Aristotle pointing to the earth. Here's Plotinus over here, and we're going to look at him now for Neoplatonism. There's a quote from Porphyry, who was a student of Plotinus. Plotinus seemed ashamed of being in the body, and that kind of gives you an idea of the Neoplatonic attitude of the material world. So why is it Neoplatonism? Well, that's a modern term. The Neoplatonists didn't think of themselves as Neoplatonists. They thought of themselves as Platonists. So Plotinus, who's really kind of considered the founder of Neoplatonism, considered himself just to be an expositor of Plato. But in fact, Plotinus and other Neoplatonists ended up being kind of a synthesis of Plato, Aristotle, and other of the Hellenistic philosophies that we've looked at, especially, say, Stoicism, and even maybe some of the attitudes of cynicism. So Plotinus was a student of another philosopher called named Ammonius Saccas, who, by the way, was the same philosopher who taught Origen. And here's where we'll get there's some overlap philosophically between Neoplatonism and Origen that goes too far, to the point where Origen goes into the realm of heresy. An essential part of Neoplatonism is the notion of the one. So this is Plato's idea of the good. This is the embodiment, or not embodiment, but it's the notion of Plato's good being beyond being. It's the source of all beauty and order in the world. And there's an idea of things proceeding from it. So everything proceeds from the one. And here's over here on the right side in this graphic, we can see how this works. So there's an emanation or procession from the one to the nous, or divine mind, which is a perfect image of the one and also the archetype of all of the lesser things. Okay, from here goes an emanation of the world soul. So the whole world, the cosmos, has its own soul. And from here is an emanation of the sensible things in the world from that soul. And this embodiment of human souls is considered a kind of tragedy. And the rational part of the soul remains attached to its origin in the one. And the irrational parts are considered to be infected by their attachment to the body. So you can see why Porphyry says Plotinus seemed ashamed of being in the body, because matter is considered evil in the sense that it's the furthest from the one. And our souls are better insofar as they are purified from it. But there's an idea of a negative kind of theology here, in that nothing can be said positively about the nature of the one. You can't predicate anything positively about the one, because it transcends all our terms. This is a notion that the Christian Neoplatonist philosopher Pseudo-Dionysius will pick up on later, and we'll get to that. So ethics in Neoplatonism, again, the goal of human existence is to return to the one. So we have this emanation and transcendence, this procession and return. Virtue prepares us for this union, and contemplation is what achieves it. So there's some sense that even in this life, in contemplation, we could achieve that union. And there's a lot of mystical language that is talked about that is used in the pagan Neoplatonists, which ends up being picked up as being closely conformed, or closely aligned in some way with Christian mysticism. So a little note here about St. Augustine and the Neoplatonists. So at some point, he relates this story in the Confessions. He comes upon the books of the Neoplatonists, and he relates what he reads in there to things from Scripture, especially the beginning of the Gospel of John, or the Son is in the form of the Father. He thought it not robbery to be equal with the God. So if we think of that notion of the back here in the graphic, the nous, the divine mind, being not equal, not the same as the one, but it is a perfect image of the one. So there's some, perhaps a reflection in that. But then he says he finds what is not reflected in there. And this, of course, is going to be articles of faith. And what I think is important to note here is that there are a lot of things that we can come to purely by the use of reason, as philosophers did. And there are some things that only takes us so far. And then we are in only what we can get at by faith. So just a very brief look at early Christianity. I already mentioned Origen and his Neoplatonic influences. The heresy of Gnosticism is largely an application of Neoplatonism to Christianity. But we have authentic integrations too, where Pseudo-Dionysius, his On the Divine Names is something that St. Thomas Aquinas refers to quite frequently, and many other theologians and philosophers throughout history. On the celestial hierarchy. So the concept of a celestial hierarchy of immaterial beings that are at those different levels in the hierarchy of Neoplatonism, in that diagram over on the side. That is something that Pseudo-Dionysius adapted to Christianity. So the celestial hierarchy being the choirs of angels. So one example of some influence on Christianity, the notion of logos. Okay, now we wouldn't quite want to draw a direct line, as seems to be done from this this slide here. But let's take a look at the concept of logos, which comes to be translated as word. But logos itself always had in ancient times a very general meaning. It could be word, it could be a statement, it could be a treatise, it could be an account or a reason for something, or an argument. So, but here are some ways that some of the philosophers we've looked at have considered logos in its very generality playing a central part of their philosophy. So Heraclitus, we talked about, he talks about a logos which holds forever, a law-like governing principle, and also that we know through the logos in some way. Now Heraclitus by nature is somewhat mysterious, and it's hard to tell exactly what he meant by this. And I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but you can see this, and you have the slides that I sent out as well. But I'm going to jump down to here. Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher who in some way was integrating aspects of Platonism and Aristotelianism into the Jewish religion, into Jewish theology. He had an idea about logos that St. John the Evangelist picked up on. And this, I think, is, from my understanding, this is a fairly secure connection to make between Philo and St. John. So Philo has a notion of logos as the image of God, as being wisdom, as in an allegorical way being a divine man, as being a model or archetype of the sensible world, and that in some way man participates in the reality of the logos. So of course, if you look at St. John, the first chapter of the gospel, or the first letter of St. John, and some places in Revelation, you'll see the employment of logos.
John,
Yes.
John goes a jump higher. He says logos is God.
I'm sorry?
I mean, John takes it all the way to say logos is God.
Exactly. So here's where he's picking up on something that was sort of seen in a vague, in a more indefinite way by Philo, and says, in fact, this thing that you sensed in some way, that you picked up on as being the image of God or being wisdom, is in fact God. There's an identity between the that nature, that eternal nature of God, and the nature of Jesus, the divine nature of Jesus. So the last thing we're going to look at here, two passages regarding St. Paul. In Acts chapter 17, he comes up, he encounters some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And I really like, let's see if I can find this here in my notes. The Ignatius Study Bible has some really good notes on this passage. But if we remember, the Epicureans at this point were pretty focused on sense pleasure as the ultimate good. And Stoics, and they also thought, they were somewhat agnostic about the gods, right? Stoics, on the other hand, thought that they had a pantheistic philosophy, right? Like we mentioned before, like the divine permeates everything. And St. Paul addresses both of these. So to the Epicureans, he'll say that God exists, first of all. So against their agnosticism, so to speak, God exists, and that he is near. And furthermore, that he will judge the world. We'll see this later. Let's see, 31. He has established a day on which he will judge the world with justice. And he is near. In him we live and move and have our being. For we too are his offspring. He's quoting a Greek poet there. And he is saying this in Athens, of course, still considered the heart of Greek philosophy. Now in verse 32, then he gets to the resurrection of the dead. And it's interesting, up to this point, they're not scoffing at him, but when he gets to the resurrection of the dead, they do. And the notes that I was reading about explain this, this would make sense because most of the Greek philosophies in some way or another devalued the body, right? So the idea that ultimate happiness is going to involve a resurrection of the body seemed ridiculous. But all of the other things he was mentioning in principle were not entirely unfamiliar. So it's interesting at that point they begin to scoff. Now note here, some of them did join him and became believers. Among them were Dionysius. Well, a philosopher in the 5th or 6th century writes in the name of Dionysius, and that's the pseudo-Dionysius I mentioned before, who wrote the divine names and the celestial hierarchy, and is quoted, who's sort of accepted as being the Dionysius, that same Dionysius, by most philosophers and theologians for a long time. Okay, and then we have this other passage from St. Paul, from his letter to the Colossians. So, especially in light of the discussions we've had so far tonight and looked at the philosophies that we've looked at, what do you think might be Paul's aim in this passage, and what do you think would be the empty or seductive philosophies? Oh, here's my light again. There we go. That he's referring to.
What passage are you talking about?
Well, in the empty seductive philosophies is in verse 8.
So I think his aim is to encourage them to reapproach the way that they approach philosophy, right? They've thus far approached everything with what is our human experience. And he's saying it has to be more than just your human experience. There has to be some relationship with God to also influence how you perceive the world and how you live your lives.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I did a little bit of reading just because I didn't really know who the Colossians were, and apparently they had a bit of pagan influence in their lives and in their practices, and so you see that I think in verse 8 when they talk about the elemental powers of the world, like very specifically are literally the elemental powers of the world, and then again on verse 16. When he mentions the new moon. So I think that pagan influence could be something he was fighting against as well. But generally I wrote any man-made morals or values which deviate from the good.
Yeah, that's great. So St. Thomas comments on this, in his commenting on this verse, he says, what St. Paul is guarding against is, on the one hand, false teaching based on like false worldly authority. So we have false, you could think of it as false propositions and false reasoning, right? So if we recall from the logic part, if we have a conclusion that's not false, or I'm sorry, a conclusion that's not true, sorry, then it must be either because we have false propositions, we have false statements that we start with, or we have faulty reasoning. So St. Thomas says that when he mentions in verse 8, seductive philosophy according to human tradition, that there he's talking about false statements, false propositions. So this would be looking at just something that's on the authority of Epicurus, or on the authority of Plato, or on the authority of any of those other philosophers. It's just handed down, and that's the only reason we consider it true. He considers, when he's looking at the elemental powers of the world, he says this would be false reasoning, such as, for instance, looking at the world and reasoning about it in an incorrect way. But just to show you the flexibility of interpretation here, St. Thomas explains first why he thinks that elemental powers of the world refers to false reasoning. And then he says, or it could mean measuring truth of faith by the truth of creatures, or it could mean the false statements from idolaters, or it could mean from the Jewish leaders by false reasoning. So there's a lot of room for interpretation there, but it all comes under this category of empty, seductive philosophy. So what is what's the solution? You know, what's the key to this? What is it really that false teaching opposes? Now this is we can look for the answer of this in verse 3. It's Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and of knowledge, right? So we have Christ now. We have that. So what in verse 17 now, going on to the last question, what do you make of his contrast between shadows and reality?
Reference to the cave, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, when I looked at this passage, that was the first thing that came to mind for me, was that contrast between the shadows on the wall and then the reality of the world above.
Funny, the first thing that came to me in context was the shadows of the Old Testament, of Judaism, and true light of Christ.
Yeah, and St. Thomas mentions both of those things when he is discussing shadows in this passage. He's talking about the shadows or the practices of the Old Testament being a shadow of the reality of Christ to come. And then he also says, if you think about seeing a shadow, if you see a shadow, you expect the reality to follow up. You expect the substance, you expect the thing to follow up behind it. So he's saying, don't get caught up in the shadows, in the incomplete, in the reflection. We have Christ, in whom we live and move and have our being, right? So any other reflections on this passage? All right. Well, that is the end of everything I had to go through, and I know the interest in New Testament, in influence on New Testament philosophy, or influence from philosophy on the New Testament writers was a very common interest among you. I couldn't find a whole lot. I didn't know a whole lot about it before, but I hope that as far as looking at these passages from St. Paul and the interesting history of just the term logos a little bit help to satisfy some of that, help to scratch that itch.
Let me mention something. In St. Paul, what did he know, and how much when did he know it? Remember, his mission is the Gentiles, not the Jews. So he didn't have the Old Testament all set in place and said, okay, now if he's talking to Jews, all he's doing is taking the Old Testament and moving it post-Christ, Christ and post-Christ, where he's going out to the Colossians, he's going to Greece, he's going to Philistine, he's going all over going all over talking to the Gentiles. Now, how much did he know? You're saying here he obviously knew something about Plato. Did he really? Or was this just inspired? After he got knocked on the horse, he went to Damascus and he got briefed for a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
Did he suddenly get inspired with all the writers from the past, all the philosophers from the past, and refuting the arguments, so that when he went out to Greece and went to all the other places, he had the answers? How much? I was trying to draw a schema. We know that Socrates and Plato and Socrates go together. Aristotle was from Plato. Plotinus was from, he got Plato's writings, but after that, there's a big gap in there of a couple hundred years. So how did these guys know all this stuff?
So that's a great point. And the first thing to mention is that my listing of philosophers and their time periods was not at all exhaustive. And I recommend to everybody looking up the podcast History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Is Peter Adamson, who does that podcast, which is now into, I don't know, somewhere around 400 episodes. He doesn't have the limitation that I have with time. So as far as the influence on St. Paul, of course we can't know. There's no evidence of what specifically St. Paul's education consisted of, but it is generally agreed that he was extremely well educated. And even though he was, we think of him as, before his conversion, as being primarily a Pharisee, still being very well educated at that time would have included some familiarity with the philosophies of the day. And you can think of it in two ways. And on the one hand, God fit him for service by the grace and the
Right.
knowledge and inspiration that he gave him. And on the other hand, you can look at it as God picked him because he had this knowledge, that he had this ability already to address the pagan philosophies. And an example of that might be in this passage that we looked at from Acts 17, where he comes to know, he's looking around Athens and he's just despondent and looking at all these pagan statues. And so he encounters some Epicureans and Stoics, and he knows just what to say to them. He knows already. And some of these philosophies especially, included a certain way of dressing. So he may have even recognized just how they were dressed, what their philosophies were. And so they're challenging him on things. And yes, he was inspired, but yes, he also had the knowledge. Do we know how much is which and how much is the other? There's no way to know that, but we can ask him when we see him.
Mm-hmm.
Let me play devil's advocate and give a potential different reading of the passage. You can read the passage to say that Paul got his head handed to him, that they were much more sophisticated philosophically than he was, that they saw him as a rube, and that's why they eventually laughed at him, and that he went away frustrated. He had very few converts there, and afterwards he said, "I'm done with this. I'm going to only preach Christ and Christ crucified now. The heck with this philosophy stuff."
Well, you're right. That could certainly be another reading. I guess I don't know how I would respond to that, but
Because he clearly after that says, from now on it's Christ and Christ crucified. That wasn't the way to go. And it's John that comes back with the big philosophical language and arguments at the beginning of his gospel.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess I would say that just because he wasn't successful in the terms um, of gaining converts doesn't necessarily mean that he was unfamiliar or that he failed in an absolute sense. Because it's one thing to fail in your use of reason or in representing the faith. It's another thing to fail in not getting converts. So
and it may just be said, well, okay, that's not the approach to use.
right.
I'm going to go with the cross, Christ crucified. I mean,
Yeah, although I think and it's evident from Paul's letters that he uses reason. So it could be that on the one hand, it's I there's a certain level where I can't really engage these philosophers on their own turf, and I retreat back to more general principles of reasoning that are more universal. So yeah, I could certainly see that reading as being another way of approaching that passage.
I have an unrelated question.
Mhm.
This is back to Plato and Socrates. So, do we know what Socrates' actual nature was? And I guess I ask that because there are other writings, and I think you referenced the clouds. I think it's in there, but there are probably some others that really, really, really make fun of Socrates and make him out to be a huge fool. I think history tells the story of him being a wise man. Is there a general consensus of which one might actually have been more accurate?
Yeah, that's great. That depends on who you ask. So there are basically three sources for Socrates himself. One, and the primary one, the biggest one in terms of volume, is Plato's dialogues, which we've already mentioned, are on a number of levels unreliable for getting at really who Socrates was. The other is, as I mentioned, another one, as I mentioned, is Aristophanes. So we have Aristophanes' The Clouds, which gives you an impression of probably how Socrates was viewed in terms of some of the main figures of his day. And then the other one is Xenophon. So Xenophon is another admirer of Socrates, but Xenophon is not nearly as sophisticated as Plato. So if you read Xenophon on Socrates, you'll get an idea that Socrates is a wise man, but maybe something more like a Dear Abby kind of wise, and not like a serious philosopher kind of wise. So then, I mean, interpretations of Socrates abound throughout history. For the most part, he's seen as the kind of the founder of Western philosophy. Then if you get to Nietzsche, he is the antithesis of what we ought to look at, and represents a failure. So there's a book it's just called Socrates, and now the name of the author is escaping me, but I'll send it out when I send out the next email, and just mention, because it kind of goes through what we can know about Socrates and what seem to be more like Plato's interpolations and additions.
Thank you.
All right, anybody else on the things we've covered today?
Good class. A lot there.
All right. So were the readings a little too much this week? Was that too much in terms of volume?
Yeah.
Depends how much time you give yourself to read them.
All right. Well, I'll send out a few readings for next week's. Next week we're going to be looking at philosophy of nature and metaphysics. So I'll try not to throw out anything too heavy for there. I mean, really, it doesn't get any deeper and perhaps more mind-bending and challenging mentally than metaphysics. But I think there's still a lot. I think we can zero in on a couple basic principles there with some primary readings. So great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You-
Yay,
But-
thank
Very much.